Okay, welcome back, everyone. It's nice to see people return after our first stream. For those that don't remember, for a quick recap, talked about bio-Leninism, how it's an appropriate label to define political opposition. And so we'd like to continue that trend by talking about what exactly did they do after high school. So we're going to go back and look at the 70s, which is kind of an interesting point because it covers some of our figures here. And so first we're going to go over the first one and how people reacted to this thing. And then afterwards, we're going to sort of digest it really seemed like a trend that seemed to continue onward. And the response promoted a certain Gen X culture and this cult of neutrality, which we'll get into later on. And then we'll get into our second and third examples. So we got quite a bit to go off of here. And so we'll start pretty soon after some housekeeping things. So for those of you that don't remember the people that we labeled as part of the bio-Leninist concept, we could also refer to them because in sociology, it's kind of hard to get lost in the terms. I would like to just transition the people that we're referring to, journalists, professors, academic types. And I would like to use the pundit class as a label here because that's where you seem to see a lot of gatekeeping. That's where you see a lot of neutrality language seem to happen in the college space and then later on in public life. But before it became like a mainstream phenomenon, you really started to see this take hold in the 70s figures. And so we're going to get into that in a sec here. I also want to emphasize a certain archetype, a character of man. I don't know if it's possible, probably futile, to remove the political identity attached to these people. I'd like us to focus on a cultural one, more broadly speaking. And so I don't want us to be so wedded to this as a political speech, although we are going to be talking about political topics. And so if the pundit class, bio-Leninism, is the antithesis, the people we're going to be describing here are the thesis. And so we're going to get into some of that here. So with this first slide, also, yes. So I think it is appropriate to narrow down where American identity is because it's a bit all over the place. There's a famous professor that is kind of all over the place with his descriptions, but he basically agrees to the fact that conservatism is kind of a schizophrenic identity. You have sort of some John Stuart Mill's philosophy, individualism, trying to mesh that with some of, for instance, Thomas Carlyle's authoritarianism. It seems that the conservative movement, especially in America, seems to be having an identity crisis. And we see there tends to be multiple factions, whether it's the New Left in California-based college circles, or whether it's these Tea Party moments, MAGA. There just seems to be this new manifestations of identity. And so I'd like us to categorize this. I believe E. Michael Jones has that term, categorization of the mind. And so I'd really like to emphasize that in this speech, because it is confusing. American identity is a bit all over the place. As somebody who we're probably familiar with has emphasized. So I think, well, actually, first we'll address this panel. So I think the fact that the US has sort of a 20th century identity and then also a 21st one, someone argue that's not the case. But I think if we look at music, as an example, we can see that there was definitely a progression, maybe a shift is the better word. Progress is usually attributed to the left. There's a style, there's a charm to it. And since we're going to be talking about British culture, the city of London could be identified in a plethora of ways, politically, socially. I'd like to kind of focus the music description here. London can be seen as having a musical identity. And so I would like to attribute that same description over to America, which has similar figures throughout the 20th century that I think are worth defending. And so a lot of people might disagree, but I want to sort of lay out the sort of complex identity that makes it a little easier to talk about. And so even on the right here, we have Howard Hughes. Even people who are not, shall we say, like relatable to us, even the elites at that time, the Henry Fords, the Howard Hugheses, they seem to adopt a culture that was very much closer to us, assimilation-wise, and they seem to be a lot more eclectic in order to have that American identity, which is distinct, despite some claims to the contrary. And so People can speculate what the causes of that are, but I'd really like to focus on a certain class, sort of the bio-Leninism that existed in the 1970s. That's where you'll find a lot of indications that kind of take us to Gamergate, as well as some other examples. So for the next, well, actually, we can go on to the next. This was, we'll be back here. We'll be back. So I think, of course, we have to use this as an example, but just to kind of help our understanding, the fact that there is a dominant culture to begin with in America, referring to the 20th century, you'll find that even subcultures are very much fractured, even if people don't see much of a distinction. For example, some of our favorite examples, Elvis. You have rock and roll kind of have these alternative identities, even though you have Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis arguably making the same kind of music in the same area at the same time, late 50s. There is still a distinction to be made with these two figures. And so in American identity that is so broad, so monolithic, I don't think you can argue that that's the case, especially when you have figures within one genre that don't exactly embody the same identities. If we had that high school hierarchy chart from last week, we could say that Elvis is a lot closer to kind of an elite personality, not just talking about the music or the social reputation, but definitely in a different space. And Jerry Lee Lewis tends to occupy somebody who is willingly rebellious, very disruptive, bad boy image. And I think that a lot of people, there's not a lot of historicism to kind of verify those claims. And so people just kind of say it's all one big thing. American identity is one big thing. But I think these distinctions are important. And that's how we're going to defend 20th century American identity. And especially towards young people, Zoomers like the ones in this class. Those are the ones that are going to need it the most, because if we don't, we're going to have to drag Generation Alpha to help us out. And I'm not looking forward to the day when they're giving us pointers. So I'd like to avoid that if we can and fix the mistakes that we have here now. So I think the next slide, that's right. So this is, many of us are probably not familiar. This is Nigel Carlsbad. He is an academic type, a tweeter. From what I'm told, he is an enjoyer of long knives. That's just the reputation. But he also emphasizes the point that revisionism is important. The fact that Zoomers especially are not equipped for conceptual frameworks. Our mutual friend over in Chicago, Thomas 777, also emphasizes this point. And I think that that's very important when we're talking about history, because even though, we're sort of talking about political groups and we're talking about certain identities that have been kind of tainted in the mainstream discourse, I would like us to kind of reclaim some of those figures, because I think a lot of them are closer to us, not politically speaking, culturally. And so that's something beneficial that I think having that framework is helpful. And so we're almost, all right, I also, final intro point here, but I also want to emphasize Catherine D., a writer who, another way to differentiate this is sort of post and pre-internet. So the digital age makes it a lot more complicated to have these identities in very accurate depictions. So she kind of talks about the before and after the internet. That might be another way to help. This is all just to help understand the distinctions we're going to be making. I don't think that this is just a shot in the dark here. I think a lot of these are very relevant. And so that's another way to do it. She also talks about the fact that when you look at modern American conservatism, there's also a lot of entertainers. I believe this was in a Washington Examiner article. There's a lot of entertainers in the political space. And a Zoomer might say, well, because Trump was an entertainer, it kind of, it goes with the territory that you're going to have people like that. But I think having those distinctions kind of loosey-goosey like that, it makes it very difficult to narrow down what is a proper identity and what is just kind of the flavor of the month trend that a lot of people don't seem to understand the implications of. So again, that's a bit much there, but that is the sort of different factions of identity within America. And so we're going to be getting into kind of arguably where it all went wrong. In the next slide here. So there's also a discussion happening on twitter.com, sort of trying to question American identity, the question itself, what exactly is it? And I'd like to highlight some of the distinctions here. It might be easier with some of the recent news when people frame Russia and China as characters, nation-wise, not strictly political, but we can sort of identify them as orderly and contrast that with the United States, which is promoting liberal democracy as a personality. And so which identity is better for the future? That's going to be a question moving forward. And when we see certain things in the past, if you take a philosophy course, you'll often see things like that. You'll see certain things that don't really mesh with the modern world, but that's because there isn't supposed to be a compromise with the modern world. The certain values of the people we're going to be talking about are going to be pre-modern, and they're not going to be things that can be assimilated into the sort of modernity mindset. That is the thing that I think is intentional. I don't think that that is a mistake or an unwillingness to adapt. I think that's very much in line with. Anyways, it'll make more sense when we get into some of the figures specifically when we get to them. Now, the argument is that 20th century American identity and 21st really is a distinction without a difference. And I'd like to say the country, as we believe it, was not designed mechanically. It has an organic culture made up of the complexity of identities from the people themselves. And when we look back at the peaks and valleys of American history, we can see that today, one of the remaining parts is the civic identity. And so that's not all there ever was, that's what's left. And unfortunately, a lot of Zoomers have taken that civic identity to be the whole thing. And so that's the thing I'd like to clarify here. I'd like to defend the 20th century one and say that a lot of the elements that are argued to be subversive are actually a lot more in line with the historic American nation. And we'll get into some of the people right here. So I think we are ready for our first example. Excuse me. We'll go on to the next one. That was fine. Yeah. We'll go into our first figure. That'll be the next one, the next slide. All right. So I know that's a bit of a long intro, but we really are talking about three identities: an American one, a British one, and a libertarian one. Richard Nixon, our favorite Quaker, Enoch Powell in Britain, and then we're going to be talking about a libertarian thinker who will make a lot more sense later on. So Nixon sort of represents the American identity that happened in the 20th century. And what tends to happen is some of these figures, as Governor Wallace did, that tends to ruin people's reputations. But I think it would warrant people's attention to think about the fact that a lot of Nixon's base was made up of the Wallace voting bloc. And so it can imply that there is a lot of more overlap than people might give credit for. It's also worth mentioning that one of the reasons why Nixon was criticized in the early 70s is because the coalition that made up his presidency was the Wallace coalition. And so you had unity between Catholics and Protestants on a national level. And that's the kind of coalition building that is very dangerous to a sort of elite, to a sort of personality that is trying to compete against those forces. And so I think a lot of that is not really told in the Howard Zinn history books. And so that is something that I'd like to bring attention to. And also, it's a matter of it's a matter of like media revisionism. The fact that, well, I mean, even today, the fact that the Overton window just keeps shifting, that should be a point of concern. The fact that Wallace was often seen as too fringe. Now Nixon also is too fringe. And so that kind of lends credence to the fact that there really is no acceptable right-wing identity. There is no one that a lot of academics will give proper attention to. And so, no, you're good, man. You're good. We got some space here. Yeah, no, for sure. It's not within view, so we're all squared away here.
Are we live?
Oh, you're just watching for the camera.
No, it's all right. Well,
I saw you guys on the live.
we're also going to be transitioning into something a bit different here, because I think a lot of people identify the Nixon legacy with Watergate exclusively, and a lot of media people in general tend to look at it exclusively in those terms. And so some of the characters that we're going to be seeing, some of the people that we talked about in high school, and some of the, I don't know, shall we say journalism, professor fields, college, certainly, a lot of that finds its home in academia. But I think into our next slide here, we're going to be talking about David. Actually, it might be more appropriate to go on to the next one. So for those that don't know, the people that instigated Watergate was Bernstein and Woodward. These are the academics that tend to be the faces of this controversy. And then you have people like David Frost. David Frost is a type, much in like the ones that we described in high school. But now these people are out of college, and now they're in public spaces, and they're doing certain things, trying to speak to power, but power already exists. And so there isn't really a way to reconcile that. Either people are going to fall in line to the will to power, or they're going to be on the sidelines and agitate, as we talked about in last week. That's what happens in high school. That's what happens in college. And it's being welcomed into the media spaces. And so I would also like to clarify, the pre-60s mindset did not encourage certain ideas that have become mainstream today. A lot of the pessimism, this kind of that's what I mean by Gen X, this pessimism, deadpan, snarky critique of the latter Nixon period just seemed to be coming from a place that is very modern. And even people at that time who maybe even didn't vote for Nixon, but I think a lot of that is kind of revisionism on the media's part. And so a lot of people don't really understand that dynamic because, again, a lot of the sources that we're citing from, alleged sources, are from these media figures, including David Frost. And so how did this class emerge, this like bio-Leninist class? Well, the New Left emerged. It's very popular in the sort of Berkeley circles, those kind of socialist-leaning types. Once those guys were welcomed, that kind of personality in college, they eventually made their way into academia and also in the media. So there was a question basically being posed to a lot of young people at that time, 60s, 70s era. Do you surrender your heritage, join the New Left, and do you wait for this thing to fade out, this movement? Or is that even really possible? Has it ever faded out? As we're seeing today, a lot of those personalities are still prevalent today. And so last week we talked about those personalities in high school. Now I want to strictly focus on the college aspect. Is that the next slide? Okay, yes, this is appropriate. So the culture on college is very complicated because it's centralized and decentralized. So it's a bit difficult to describe, although the result is they're trying to legitimize public discourse for a certain personality. Once these types have the networks in college, they are eligible into the media and government spaces. And so this is no longer a college phenomenon. This is now happening out in public. And then it's basically a national recruiting program that has people thinking like college students, thinking like professors, even if they don't see themselves as that type. That's why culture is important to emphasize. It's like an invisible code of conduct. And that's how we got Gamergate, by the way. A lot of people saw this indie video game space as neutral, but obviously any power that is not wielded will be wielded by those willing to do so. So let me see here. So I also want to emphasize this. This slide has a number of characters here, but here's the thing. One of the things specifically, I want to distance myself from the political angle. I'm merely looking at these things as far as in the social realm, kind of in a sociology context. I want to talk about the fact that what these people promote, it's not about political rhetoric. It's not about social views. Well, technically it's social views, but more so in a less partisan way, it really has to do with neutrality. That is the mantra that a lot of them talk about. Neutrality is a word that is used to disarm opposition. And a lot of the personalities themselves that talk about neutrality are not doing it themselves. So imagine that. You have journalists and media pundits. None of these people were elected, by the by, but you have these people talking in those terms. And that is exactly how power is exerted. And so that's a dynamic that I think is kind of underrated, but I think to really address, when Jordan Peterson disagrees with leftists, when you hear Ben Shapiro types discredit them for, viewing things that they don't think are consistent. To me, the thing to focus on the most is neutrality, is this thing that they want to have existed in all frames. And that's why David Frost was upset with Richard Nixon, that infamous interview where he said, if the president does something, that makes it correct. What he's basically describing is a Carl Schmitt principle. He is describing the fact that the head of state can assert the exceptional positions. And so if we recognize that we are living in a hierarchical system, then we have to sort of lose ego, lose pride, and allow heads of state to exert power in appropriate ways. So I think a lot of that is not really addressed because I think, like we said earlier, a lot of people are trying to mesh John Stuart Mill individualism, mesh authoritarianism and democracy. And this whole diet is just wrong. And that's how you get stuff like this. Dinesh D'Souza is a guy who is trying to reconcile modern views with pre-modern views. And what you end up with is looking at the Republican Party during the 20th century in a very in a very narrow way. And it just doesn't really, it's not really consistent with a lot of the conservatism that exists today. It doesn't mesh well. And who else? Yes, and then of course, Jason Stanley, very infamous on Twitter. He is somebody who talks about the fact that when we're looking at authoritarianism, or really just order within political space in general, a lot of that is inherently problematic because he is very skeptical of things like monarchy. Power in general is something that is very intrusive to private citizens, but that's kind of always how it's been. And so it's a matter of how do you view those certain things without sort of antagonizing people who vote for Nixon, Enoch Powell, Wallace. I think that there's an appropriate way to do so, and I'd like to welcome those people in to have a space rather than shouting them down, because I don't think that's going to be proven effective in the long run. So, and so that's the pundit class, always partisan. And we also see worldviews condemned in moral language. And so I think that's one of the most, one of the telltale signs that that kind of language that was promoted at the college level is present in the media level. And I find that to be something that just doesn't really work in the long term. So we're going to switch gears here. Instead of looking at British politics from this, from a conventional sense, I would like to look at it as kind of a continuation, one regime to the next. But a lot of the academic types will talk about the fact that we now have to view things graduating from the most controversial ones. So one of the most notorious ones is National Front. This is not just any party, it's a fascist party. And everything since then is supposed to be on this trajectory, steering away from that party. And so with this recent Italian election, I mean, obviously we can speculate as to how authentic a lot of the people involved are, but you can see that kind of talk all over the coverage. And that kind of speaks to, again, the personalities that we kind of take for granted and don't really understand where they're coming from. So, and you know, this kind of looking at George Wallace, looking at Richard Nixon and Enoch Powell through this very like antisocial lens. I think it's what Darren Beattie coined in one of his tweets. I believe it was intellectual colonization, the idea that we're going to limit the way we think, the way that we look at philosophers, even people, you know, within our grandparents' lifespan. I would like to look at it from a more nuanced view and see those people as not, you know, condemnably evil, but to just kind of look at a lot of these characters as men of their time, men who are thinking in terms of 100 years. And a lot of that, by definition, is radical. A lot of that kind of welcomes in ideology that doesn't mesh with modernity. And so that's just some of the dilemmas that I think a lot of people get hung up on. And also, you know, the reason why stuff like this continues to exist, people tend to have a parasocial relationship to media figures, people like Shapiro and Peterson. Jordan Peterson just released relatively recently, his conservative manifesto, where he outlines values in relation to other ideologies. And that's supposed to be the big win. That's supposed to be, you know, I certainly couldn't have come up with anything better. So I concede the framing of history through this lens. And maybe I can't make sense of all of it, but directionally it's going in the right spot. And so who am I to give my attention to anybody else? Who else is worthy? These are the ways that young people are isolated by the pundit class. They're watching a lot of this content and thinking it's a fix-all. They're thinking that this answers a lot of questions, but actually there's a big gap. And so we're trying to fill that enthusiasm gap. And a lot of that is the mindset of the people when they see stuff on the timeline. They don't even think about the algorithm. They don't think about why that's being marketed to them on their timeline. The co-founder of Cars and Women magazine, Stan Haynes, he is notorious for having this take. Very insightful guy, has a way with words. And he describes the people who lay these arbitrary boundaries, cutting off the controversial ones and sticking to the standard history book version. He tends to call these guys culture warriors. The fact that these people notice things, move on, and a lot of their readers are often kept in the dark, whereas they are the gatekeepers that sort of have these people. The academics are definitely in the know, but a lot of the people that follow them, there is this big gap in knowledge. And so I think it's a little disingenuous to have that kind of a gap between, intellectually speaking, between the speaker and the people who are following the content. So I'd like to also bring that into attention. And also, you know, these people, these gatekeeper types, I mean, this is not an academic term, but they are studio gangsters, okay? They are not worth the food stamps. They mastered the bang and the slang and the mentals, but the people that they're going off of are not from Compton, Shaw, and South Central. That's true, okay? That's true. But many of these things that we take for granted, like the legacy of people like Nixon, the people like George Wallace, a lot of that stuff is not really verified. So I'd like to bring some attention to that. Now, sorry for the wait, but I would like to get into some of the Enoch Powell. So can we? Oh, well, first, okay, that's the other thing too. Here, we're kind of all over the place, but you know, the fact is, even at the time, the 70s, when a lot of these, you know, bio-Leninist types were marching through the streets, a lot of them were intimidating. A lot of them were kind of confronting some of the most famous figures, people like David Bowie, people like Eric Clapton, who make public statements supporting dissident views and even lending some credence to parties like the National Front. I'm not really concerned about the political implications per se, but you know, I think the Clash is sort of a certain symbolic band. The fact that in 1977, this is the same year that Elvis died, the fact that they wrote a song saying Elvis, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, that's all in the past. We're going to have a new youth movement moving forward. Well, what's that youth movement going to be defined by? What's going to be the philosophy behind it? Because they also have a song on that same debut album in 77 called White Riot. And there's speculation as to what that's about. Is that about white civil rights? Is that about being in the same league as some of the racial groups during the 1970s sort of decadent culture? And I think a lot of that, again, there's not any verification. It's all just testimony from the people after the fact. And you can sense in a lot of these interviews, there's a lot of bullying. There's a lot of, you know, you must submit to a certain mainstream view of these things. And so I think when that kind of barges its way into the pop culture space, it does lend credence to some of the political implications. And so that's just some examples of non-political people having to face these things. It's not something that's really avoidable at this point. So when I talk about Nixon, Wallace, and a lot of controversial types, it's not to support or defame. It's more so to kind of face who are these people in this point in time. And I sort of want to correct the record and see what is the identity for a lot of people moving forward, because a lot of people are going to listen to that music and they're going to eventually read about these people and not what exactly is the framing going to be? What's the history books going to be in the next years if the Overton window keeps shifting? And so that's just, that's the overall theme. Now, I think the next one is, okay, we already went over that, but that's okay. We'll go into the next slide. The thing that I want to address today about Enoch Powell is when Powell describes immigration in unflattering terms, he is part of a different breed, a breed that was in the majority before the civil rights era, reference to the American counterpart. But even if we don't like these people, again, very similar to Trump, very talking in the grand scheme of things, talking about things down the line, people that people aren't really thinking about. Powell is one of those people who spoke in terms that Nixon didn't say publicly, but is definitely in that same class because again, they are outliers. They are people that don't really fit in that conventional left and right dichotomy. There's sort of a lot of wiggle room there. And so when Powell gave a famous speech, the Rivers of Blood speech in Birmingham, he did a similar media tactic that Trump did when he was talking about terrorism, I think during the first few months of his administration. Enoch Powell talked about testimony from his constituents, talking about the real fear that they were facing. For those that don't know, in Britain, there were a lot of riots. There was a lot of agitation, very similar to America, 1960s, sort of revolutionary people in the streets. And so what happened was a lot of those same, when we talked about David Frost earlier, David Frost, Enoch Powell, was very, cynical about his whole approach, talking in this very explicit way. And that's what Nixon did. Nixon didn't, that's what Nixon did in that interview. He often doesn't do it publicly, but even when that little slip up came, that was enough to disqualify him as far as the mainstream narrative was concerned. And so you see the same behavior coming from the same types in the same departments. David Frost, so a lot of these journalism types were happening in Britain, happening in America. And so it's kind of this worldwide phenomenon that we're going to have to address, this kind of journalist class that is very, it agitates. It's very hard to have like a dialogue between the two. And so we're just going to have to be a lot more honest about where the discourse is going and how exactly we're going to make room for people who are sympathetic to some of these figures. Because again, that's not going back that long. The 1970s are not that long ago. And so also, Watergate, Enoch Powell basically being disinvited from British politics before returning. This is all the same managerial, things that are happening in politics. The fact that people are removed, even if they're popular, there really is no representation for people who are dissidents, for people that have some of these concerns. And if some of the rhetoric is explicit, that was something that back then was just part of the course. Now we're going to condemn it because of these journalistic terms that we have to set everything to. And so that's a way of looking at things, a personality that's just not very sustainable. And so I think we're getting towards some of our last examples here. So that's the thing, the cult of neutrality, views that, anything before the 1960s would not have been critiqued in the same fashion. And I think yeah, that's true. All right, so we're gonna get to our final example here. So I don't even know how to say, that's all right, the Nick, this libertarian type. For those that don't know, the libertarian sphere is also going through an identity crisis, very similar to conservatism. A lot of people that weren't really expecting the shift during the 2016 election. I think a similar thing is happening in the Mises caucus. A lot of the libertarians that were invested in that caucus that may not have been in the know, not really up to par with a lot of the dissident views. A lot of them were pretty, maybe not surprised, but they certainly were not supportive of a lot of the people that were falling more in line with Murray Rothbard, Hans Hermann Hoppe, a lot of these right-leaning libertarian types. And one of them is Nick. This is one of the faces of Reason magazine, sort of the libertarian outlet. And he was reacting to the Italian election. Now, again, this is not steering away from politics because I'm not even supporting people in the Italian election, but I'm talking about the fact that, the language that is being used in public, a lot of the tweeting that is happening, a lot of it is concerned about identities from the past, the fact that that's something we have to run away from. And I don't think that that's really appropriate because a lot of these views honestly are not even radical. And so I think that's one of the big misunderstandings is that these things are implicitly there to agitate, to make people feel bad, the fact that there's hatred behind it. A lot of those are assumptions. We even hear some of that stuff here on campus. So I think that clarifying that if the libertarians are getting their act together, we really have to step up and confront this identity that has yet to be confronted. So I think we have one last slide here. All right. Yes, that is correct. So in conclusion, the reason why people, political and apolitical, the reason why I want to talk about, the reason I want to kind of think about the fact that people try to argue in their heads where exactly they fall on the political spectrum, who exactly they should support, and what is palatable to a lot of their friend groups. I think a lot of that thinking is unsustainable. And I think we're going to graduate from that in the years to come, because when we look at Europe and a lot of the elections, even if some of the populist rhetoric and some of the victories, so to speak, may not be authentic according to some true believers, I think that a lot of this can show that the way we view identity and personalities within political spaces is definitely going to change. And so it's not in the journalist's interest, it's not in the media interests to allow stuff like that to happen. And so there has to be a sort of grassroots approach to the media. There has to be this sort of kind of local activism in as far as like getting involved in those networks, so to speak. Not activism. Again, that's another one. Activism conventionally means marching in the streets and doing all this physical public demonstration stuff. Even that is a little 60s, okay? That's like almost 7 years old at this point. And so that's another thing, just rethinking a lot of this stuff and trying to avoid a lot of the gatekeeping types, because Sam Francis, a scholar, he talks about the hesitation that people have to confront a lot of identities that they think are too old, too blunt, a little too something that appeals to boomers, but maybe not Gen Z. I think that is something that we have to look at with a more sober analysis, and we have to reclaim our identity as Zoomers. So thank you very much. All right. I think I almost said it. If there's any Q&As, we can wrap up here, because I saw there was, that was quite lengthy, but I think we're going to look at some of the chat here, because obviously there is some, I want to start with that one first, since I think that would be appropriate. But anyways, got some David Vengel. Yeah, thank you. All right, I think we had Charlemagne, good to see you here. All right, I think we have AF $20. Thank you. I appreciate that. That was all right. Do we have any questions? I don't want to sort of putting me on the spot here. I got all right. I think this is practice. This is a presentation. This is not practice. This just happened. So all right. Well, I think we'll wrap that up. But hey, awesome. Unless there's about religious. All right. Well, David, we'll ask that question in the Telegram chat. All right. We got a lot of people here, so we'll get that at an appropriate time. But all right. There we go.